Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Hi, it's Thomas from Smart Edition Academy. In today's video, we're reviewing a GED Social Studies practice test. You can take this test with me for free by accessing the link below for a free GED practice test. There are 45 questions on this practice test. I will review each one by one and explain the correct answer. In the links below, you will also find access to our free GED study group and our GED online study course. Let's get started. All right, here we go. Question 1. Now, before we dive into the question, a bit of advice for GED test day. You're going to see a lot of passages and images on the social studies test, and the first thing you might want to do is read the passage. This is a bad idea for two reasons. One, on test day you're probably going to be under a lot of stress, meaning that your eyes might miss key details, your mind might not be into the act of reading because of the stress. And two, by the time you finish reading a document like this, or maybe something longer, you might have already forgotten key details, even if you weren't stressed out. So my advice, every single question on the social studies test, take a look at the little introduction in bold, and then jump right down to the question. And that's exactly what we're going to do with each of these, and I'm going to teach you some tips and tricks along the way so you can find the right answer in the quickest amount of time possible. Okay, first, let's take a look at our category, the earliest Americans and the age of exploration. The following passage is the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact was a document signed by the passengers on the Mayflower. Read the passage and answer the question. Why did the signers refer to settling in the northern parts of Virginia? Was it because Virginia was still unsettled in 1620? Portugal was trying to settle Virginia? France had claimed southern Virginia? Or England had already established Virginia as a colony? So, my recommendation, as we skim the passage, take a key idea from each answer choice and see if it lines up with anything in the text. So we have an idea here that unsettled, and we can just think about these three countries too, Portugal, France, and England. We're looking out for them to see if they're the right answer. Okay, that said, the correct answer for number 1 is A. Virginia was still unsettled in 1620. Now, how do we know that? Let's use our skimming. Like I said, keep these ideas in mind, unsettled and our three countries, and let's see what we can do. All right, so we're going to skim. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. And the first thing we see in the second line, oh, France. France is there, but I don't see anything about them claiming anything. It's in a list of countries. All right, we're going to keep going though. Okay, nothing yet, nothing yet. Oh, wait, there it is. The Mayflower Compact says they are going to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. And that makes A correct, and that already tells you that this D is incorrect too. So, as long as you skim, you will find that correct answer. Now, if you have a little extra time, be my guest. Take a look at the sentence later, take a look at the sentence before, but if you're pressed for time or you're naturally a slow reader, use the skimming and look for those cues that each answer choice is giving you. Okay, we're going to reinforce this as we keep going throughout the test, but that's just our first example of skimming and how it can work in your favor. Okay, question 2. Now, when it comes to paired questions like this with the same passage, there's a good chance that the second or third question, depending on how many there are, is going to be looking at a different place in the document. It's going to ask you something about a different paragraph or a different part of the document. So keep that in mind. Maybe this one will too. Question 2. What was the function of the Mayflower Compact for the colonists? It declared that they were legally equal to King James. It rejected the King of England because of his persecution. It affirmed that Massachusetts would only be for Puritans, or it established a government that would be loyal to England. The correct answer is D. The Mayflower Compact colonists in 1620 wanted to create a government that would be loyal to England. They were going to manage things on their end, but King James I, he's still in charge of their lives. Okay, before we go into the document, one thing we know right away is that C is incorrect, because we already know that they are in Virginia and not Massachusetts. So we can get rid of that one automatically, as long as we've read those first few sentences and refer back to our question 1. We know they're in Virginia. They're not in Massachusetts. Okay, so how do we know that D is correct? Well, look at what they say just in the first part that we've already read. This man, the sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, defender of the faith, and heaven undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. They are making this guy sound really, really good. They are, it's almost like a compliment, even though it's just listed as titles as King of England. And also at the bottom, we see him again, Sovereign Lord King James of England. When someone is your sovereign, they are your ruler. And in England then, and England today, the king or queen is the defender of the faith. They are, even though it's mostly a ceremonial role now, they are the head of the Anglican Church. They have roles in government, although limited. But back then, though, 400 plus years, if you were a subject under the British Crown, you were going to create a colony that's going to be loyal to your king. Now, as far as A and B are concerned, these colonists obviously do not think they are equal to the king. They're not royalty. And rejecting the king because of persecution, that's not going to happen until the American Revolutionary War. That's 150 plus years away. So definitely in 1620, they're going to be loyal to England 100%. Okay, question 3 coming up. All right, we have a bigger passage. And like I said, this may freak you out a bit, especially if you're stressed or if you're a slow reader. But let's keep using our skills and our tips and tricks, and we're going to show you how to break this down really easily. Again, first thing, category, the American Revolution and the growth of a nation. The following passage is an excerpt from George Washington's farewell address given in 1797. Read the passage and answer the question. We're jumping right down to that question. In referring to regional disputes, what is Washington most likely referring to? Tariffs, slavery, industrialization, or Native Americans? He is referring to slavery. The be-all, end-all regional dispute between the North and South that would lead to the Civil War in 1861. Now, how do we know this? Well, if you know your history, you could probably get this one right just by guessing. But let's take a look at the document. Let's see where we can find these regional disputes. And like I said, we're going to skim. We're going to look for something negative because a dispute is a negative thing. And we're just going to take a look. We're just going to go down, skim really lightly. Okay, nothing yet. So we're going to get rid of that. Okay. All right, here we go. After the little ellipse right here. In contemplating the causes which may disturb our union. Okay, there's something negative going on here. Let's go a bit deeper. Matter of serious concern that any ground should be furnished for characterizing parties by geographical discriminations, northern and southern. He's actually bringing up north and south, how this dispute is already happening. So if you can keep in mind that the main friction between North and South, even 7 decades before the Civil War, was already happening, you know there's a slavery connection there, because some northern states are already getting rid of slavery at this point, and southern states are actually digging in more and more into the institution of slavery because they're more agrarian, agriculture is their thing, and they need slaves to do it. Okay, that's where we see it, right here. Okay, question 3, slavery. Let's see what this passage throws at us in question 4. Okay, like I said before, we already have a question that's talking about this paragraph. We're probably, maybe not, going to have a question about paragraph 2. So let's keep that in mind, and maybe that's right. Why does Washington feel that the Union is the path to greater safety for the United States? The individual states could not survive economically. The individual states are stronger as a collective unit. Britain would likely attack individual states if given the opportunity, or the individual states were too vulnerable to Native American attacks. The correct answer is B. The individual states are stronger as a collective unit. You got to remember, at this time in American history, the Constitution had only been around for about a decade. That had brought the states together into our current form of government. Before the Constitution, each state had equal footing with the other states, and the federal government was relatively weak. It made for a lot of disagreements and for a weak country. And now that the states have been brought closer together under the Constitution, we are a stronger country for it. But let's take a look where we find this. Now, like I said earlier, maybe it's in paragraph 1, maybe it's in paragraph 2, but we know that paragraph 1's already talking about the Union, so let's keep our focus there, and that's exactly where we find it. Right here. Let me read this to you. While then, in every part of our country thus feels an immediate and particular interest in union, all the parts combined cannot fail to find in the united mass of means and effort greater strength, greater resource, proportionability, greater security from external danger, and a less frequent interruption of their peace by foreign nations. What Washington is basically saying is that if we work together, we can survive as a young country. And that's exactly what he's talking about in this middle section of paragraph 1. We're better off working together as a collective unit than a confederation of independent states. All right. Question 5. Coming up. Same passage. New question. Which of the following statements best describes the foreign policy Washington is recommending? Is it remaining friendly but neutral against other nations? Finding a new ally in Europe for protection against the British? Trying to reestablish close ties with Great Britain to improve trade? Or remaining in a close alliance with France because of its earlier support? The correct answer is A. Washington wanted the country to remain friendly with foreign countries, but be neutral in terms of foreign wars and conflicts and any other disagreements countries in Europe would have against each other. He knew that America was too young, it was too weak to get pulled into such conflicts that could possibly destroy the young nation. So that's why he had this idea. All right, and where do we see this? Well, we have already taken a long look at this paragraph with our previous 2 questions, and we know we really don't see anything about foreign countries. So we're going to skip to paragraph 2. And the first word, look, is Europe. So we're talking about foreign countries. We know right away that our answer is in this paragraph. And here's where it is. Let me do that for you right here. Hence, therefore, it must be unwise for us to implicate ourselves by artificial ties, meaning treaties and alliances, in the ordinary vicissitudes of her politics or the ordinary combinations of her friendships and intimies. Europe back then had a war basically every 20 years. They were usually small wars, but if you knew anything about Europe back then, it was that these countries love going to war, they love having alliances, and every generation there's a new round of bloodshed. And Washington knows this. So he's telling his country, don't get caught up in this. Look, our detached and distant situation invites us for a different course. We're on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. We do not have to get caught up in their drama in Europe. So he's telling his fellow Americans, look, be friendly with European countries, but don't get alliances with them. It's just going to drag you into warfare. So being neutral is the best way forward, and that's what Washington believed until the day he died. Okay, question 5. Coming up, question 6. New big passage, a lot going on, but let's take a look at what's it about and then jump to the question. Category, becoming a world power. The following passage is an excerpt from a speech given by Franklin Roosevelt as his annual message to Congress in 1941, just before our entry into World War II. Read the passage and answer the question. All right, let's see what's going on here. How does Roosevelt believe that the Axis threats against the United States will begin? Quick reminder, the Axis powers were Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. And at this point, when Roosevelt's giving his speech, they're all caught up in World War II. America's not yet. So, how does Roosevelt believe that the first Axis threat against the United States will happen? A direct invasion across the Atlantic? Economic warfare by the Axis powers? Bombing of American cities from Europe? Or the establishment of hostile bases in Latin America? So, basically, Central and South America. The correct answer is D, the establishment of hostile bases in Latin America. So how do we know this? Again, we're going to have to go to skimming, keeping an idea for each answer choice in mind. The idea being invasion, economics, bombing, and Latin America. So let's go to our top and see where we can find that. All right. Okay, so we're talking about war. And we don't see anything yet about bombing or anything just yet. Let's see. Excuse me. All right. We see here that the first phase, the first phase of the invasion of this hemisphere would not be the landing of regular troops. Okay, so we can get rid of an answer choice. He's not talking about invasion. The necessary strategic points would be occupied by secret agents and their dupes, and great numbers of them are already here and in Latin America. The answer is right there. You don't need to read into it. Roosevelt's just saying it to the world. The Axis powers are going to try to create bases and try to have a foothold in Latin America first. And that's why we get our right answer. Latin America, a lot of Latin American countries at this time were neutral nations, and Axis warships, Axis advisors were there. Absolutely true. Okay. All right, moving on to question 7. All right, same passage, of course. New question. When Roosevelt suggests that the U.S. policy should be supporting those who are resisting aggression, what policy will this lead to? Lend-Lease, a declaration of war, the 14 points, or the League of Nations? Correct answer is the Lend-Lease program. Now, before the United States entered World War II in December 1941, the policy of the American government was to lend war materials to the Soviet Union and Great Britain. Now, we weren't selling them to these countries because that could be seen as an act of war. We were simply handing over tanks and ships and anything else you can imagine and saying, hey, we're lending these to you. Use them as you will, and when the war's over, give them back. And if they get destroyed, don't worry about it. So we were sort of skirting international law by sort of entering the war and sort of staying on the neutral side. And where do we see this, though? Where do we see this idea show up? Now, it's in our next section about national policy. And that's where you should be focusing as the word policy shows up on our question here, and it shows up here. Now, we're going to skim it, and I will find you the section that gives us our great clue. Second, by an impressive expression of the public will and without regard to partisanship, we are committed to full support of all those resolute peoples everywhere who are resisting aggression and are thereby keeping war away from our hemisphere. By this support, we express our determination that the democratic cause shall prevail, and we strengthen the defense and security of our own nation. What he's basically saying is that because we're lending the British and the Soviets war materials, we are keeping the war out of the Western Hemisphere where we live. The war stays in Europe, and we get to stay safe in the United States. And that was his argument in early 1941. Most Americans at this time were still pretty iffy on joining the war, and it would only take the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor to solidify American opinion into entering the war. So Roosevelt, like I said, at this time, his audience, the American people, are still very weary of entering war. So this was a compromise in a way. We're going to save ourselves. We're going to keep the war away from us by helping the people who need our help in Europe. And that was his argument, Lend-Lease. If you need a little help, though, beyond that, a few historical points to keep in mind. The 14 points and the League of Nations were President Woodrow Wilson's ideas in World War I, 20 plus years before. And like I said just now, Roosevelt's not going to float the idea of a declaration of war to the American people. Nothing had yet happened to the United States. Pearl Harbor was still a few months off, so he couldn't have done that. And that's why Lend-Lease is correct. Okay, question 8. Same passage. Let's see what we have to do now. Why does Roosevelt feel that the Axis powers pose a long-term danger to the United States? They sought dominion of other continents. There was a fear they might lose against Russia. The United States depended on trade with Great Britain, or Roosevelt feared that Nazism would appeal to Americans. Now, this is one of those questions where you can think about what you've already done with a previous question, and it might give you a little clue. And that's exactly what this one does. Our correct answer is A. The Axis powers sought dominion of other continents. We already get this feeling previously because we know from a previous question that the Axis powers are creating bases and bringing people into Latin America. They're bringing their military advisors, their warships, trying to win the influence of politicians down there, which was actively going on in the early 1940s. So he's trying to say that, yes, they're going to start in Latin America, and then, you know what's going to happen next? We're going to get attacked in North America, United States and Canada. So if we remember that previous question, we have this one already done without even having to look back at the document. Now, as far as our other answer choices are concerned, now, Russia, we weren't fighting with Russia yet, but we wanted Russia to win. So this answer choice B doesn't make any sense. We want Russia to beat the Axis powers in Europe. Did we have trade with Great Britain? Of course we did, but we didn't depend on it. America in 1941 was very self-sufficient, everything from materials to oil to everything you need to fight a war. Now, D is plausible. A fair number of Americans before America enters World War I, they weren't Nazis per se, but they were sympathetic to Germany for a lot of reasons. Now, he doesn't mention this, though, so we have to think, okay, this could be true, but if it's not in the document, we can't say it's a correct answer. We do have an example, though, that tells us 100% that A is correct. The Axis powers are expanding both militarily and diplomatically, and for that reason, they are a long-term danger to the United States. Okay, moving on. Question 9. New document, and thankfully it's a lot shorter. The earliest Americans and the age of exploration. The following passage is an excerpt from William Penn's Charter of Privileges. Written in 1701 when Penn was the governor of Pennsylvania, it offered a list of rights that were guaranteed to residents. Read the passage and answer the question. So, we know we're dealing with pre-revolutionary times. North America, most of North America is a British colony, and the people we think of Americans are still loyal British citizens. So prime your brain with these facts before going in, and that'll get you started just right to answer the question. Okay, what kind of government did the Charter of Privileges establish? A theocracy, a monarchy, a direct democracy, or a representative democracy? The correct answer is representative democracy. The roots of our current representative democracy go back to this period. The founders in 1776 didn't think up all of this stuff just on their own. They looked at what the colonies had used before. Now, where do we find this in the document? Like I said, it's a short document, so we're going to skim it. And we're going to take a look at a type of government. I don't see that here. Ah, for the governing. Okay, we're talking about government. This is where the answer is. So I'm going to highlight it, and let's take a look. For the well-governing of this province and territories, there shall be an assembly yearly chosen by the freemen thereof, to consist of 4 persons out of each county, of most note of virtue, wisdom, and ability, or of a greater number at any time, as the governor and assembly shall agree, upon the 1st day of October forever. What does this sound like? It sounds like the people in each county are picking a couple of representatives to go to an assembly hall and govern on their behalf. This is representative democracy in a nutshell. And that's our answer, right front and center. If it was a direct democracy, everyone from all the counties would be gathering together. If it was a monarchy, it would just be one person. And if it was a theocracy, it would be a religious leader, maybe a pastor or a priest or something like that. But since the people are choosing the representatives, we have representative democracy. And there we go. All right, question 10 coming up. Same passage, new question. Which of the following is most likely to have been influenced by the Charter of Privileges? Is it the Bill of Rights, the Articles of Confederation, the Emancipation Proclamation, or the Declaration of Independence? All 4 very important documents in American history. The correct answer is the Bill of Rights. Those first 10 amendments to the Constitution that lay down our civil rights as Americans, as in the freedom of religion, the freedom to have a jury trial, so on and so forth. Now, how do we know that? Well, we already have our answer from here, from our previous question. Let's jump up to the first paragraph, take a look, see if we can find an answer. Because no people can be truly happy, though under the greatest enjoyment of civil liberties, if abridged of their freedom of their consciousness, as to their religious profession and worship, I do by grant and declare that no person or persons inhabiting in this province or territories shall be in any case molested or prejudiced in his or their person or estate because of their conscientious persuasion or practice. He is saying that no matter what religion you are, you will be able to profess and practice that religion freely in the British colony of Pennsylvania. And these ideas, everybody, became the foundation that leads to the First Amendment, the cornerstone of the Bill of Rights. As for our other 3, let's take a brief look at our distractors. The Articles of Confederation were America's first constitution during the American Revolution. It said that all states were equal to each other and allowed for a very, very weak federal government. This didn't work out. A lot of conflict happened, and for that reason, the founders, drafted the Constitution in 1787. The Emancipation Proclamation was from the Civil War. President Abraham Lincoln published it in 1862 as basically a last-ditch effort to convince slave states to rejoin the Union. It said that if you're a slave state that's in rebellion, if you come back before January 1st, 1863, you get to keep your slaves. If you keep fighting after that date, once America wins the war, all the slaves there are going to be free. So it was the first step towards abolishing slavery. Last but not least, the Declaration of Independence was drafted in July 1776. It was the document that made a formal political break between the American colonies and Great Britain. And which was, although it did not spark the American Revolution, it was the document that told the British, we are not coming back. no matter what. We are going to have our own country, and we're going to fight to the end for it. So, for those reasons, B, C, and D are incorrect. All right. Moving on to question 11. Looks like we have a longer document, and we have a new category, Civil War times, mid of the 19th century, mid-1800s. The following passage is an excerpt from the Declaration of Sentiments from the Seneca Falls Convention, an early convention of an early feminist movement, women asking for greater rights. Read the passage and answer the question below. Elizabeth Cady Stanton modeled this document on which other famous document in U.S. history? So we're again asked, what's the relationship between two documents? Did she use the Constitution, the Gettysburg Address, the Emancipation Proclamation, or the Declaration of Independence as a model? She uses the Declaration of Independence as a model for this document. How do we know? Well, if you've done your studying and are familiar with these documents, you will see it in the very first line. We hold these truths to be self-evident. This little line right here is the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. And one thing she does right away to modify it is to say that all men and women are created equal. This was not in the original Declaration, but she is using it as a template to expand on these revolutionaries' ideas of equality, and for that reason, she is calling back to this earlier document, saying we need a new Declaration of Independence, not from Great Britain, but from the oppression men are putting on women. Now, this relationship also shows up later in the document. We see this list down here, and each line starts with the word he. Or most of them do, except this one right here. In the original Declaration of Independence, the latter section was all about discussing all the crimes and injustices of King George III. And they all started this way. He has done this, he has done that. And they were talking about the king and reasons why that this breakup between the American colonies and Great Britain had to happen. In her case, though, the word he refers to just men. As we can see, he has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to elective franchise. Men have never let women vote. She is saying it is time for women to get the vote. Unfortunately, though, that would not happen for another 80 years or so after this document was drafted. But she is using the template, like I've been saying, of the Declaration of Independence. Now, if you're having a little trouble with this, but let's say you know your time scale, let's say you know that this document comes from before the Civil War, which it did, we know that B and C are incorrect. These documents didn't even exist when this document that you're asked to read was written. So B and C are out. The Constitution, though, if you need a little help, the Constitution begins with "we the people" in order to form a more perfect union. That's not what she writes here, though. So if you can keep that first line in mind of the Declaration and the Constitution, you'll get a good idea of whether or not she's using that document as a template. Okay, Declaration of Independence. Moving on to question 12. Same document, new question. What does Elizabeth Cady Stanton mean by evident? Factual, hidden, apparent, or mysterious? The correct answer is C, apparent. Now, before we go into why, a quick note. On the GED Social Studies test, you are going to see a few vocabulary-based questions. And what you're most likely going to do is use context clues. Our strategy going into getting this question right is to first find the word, and then take a look at maybe the sentence before and the sentence after to get an idea about, what does this word mean in the context of what is being written? So we know it's apparent. Let's find out. Let's see. Let's find the word apparent. I'm sorry, use the word evident, I'm sorry, evident. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Okay. Now it shows up in the very first line, which means we can't use anything before to give us clues, but we have to look at things that come after. So let's take a look, like we said a moment ago, at the first little bit of this paragraph to get our answer. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving from their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, like I said, most of this comes directly from the Declaration of Independence. And the idea of these rights of men, and in her case of women too, are very apparent. She is listing them out for us. Just to restate the obvious, that all people, men and women, should have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it is apparent to her, it's apparent to her readers, and that's the argument she's making, that, yeah, these are truths, but we have to turn these truths into reality. We have to pass new laws and give women the vote and give them greater rights. Now, these aren't necessarily facts, because she's making an argument. You have to remember she's arguing for rights, so she's going to be using opinions, she's going to be using arguments, and also put in a few facts, but that's not where her idea is here about evident. Things definitely aren't hidden either. She is listing out a bunch of ideas, so nothing's hidden here, and nothing is mysterious. She is laying down very clear arguments that would appeal to women reading this, it would appeal to progressive men reading this. There is nothing mysterious about here. Things are apparent. It's all for the world to see, and there's nothing mysterious or hidden about it. Okay, so we have our first vocab question. Evident means apparent. So like I said before we move on, context clues are your friend, and even if you're not 100% sure, reading that paragraph can help you get rid of, like I said, answer choices B and D, and if you can cut down 2 incorrect answers, your odds of guessing correctly go up tremendously. Use guessing as your friend and process of elimination as well. Okay, moving on to question 13. New document, new category. Category: the 20th century and beyond. The following passage is an excerpt of a communication sent by a State Department employee, George Kennan, to Washington, D.C. in 1946. Read the passage and answer the question below. Now, a little bit of information before we go to the question. George Kennan was probably one of the most influential U.S. diplomats in American history, especially the 20th century. When he wrote this document, he was in Moscow, part of the Communist Soviet Union, and he was working in the American Embassy. He knew a lot about Soviet life, about their politics, about their leader Joseph Stalin, and as the war had just ended the previous year in 1945, he was gathering all of these ideas together about, now that the war against Hitler is over, what's the conflict and going to be between the capitalist democratic United States and the communist dictatorship, which was the Soviet Union. So with that information, let's take a look at our question. Which of the following policies would Kennan have been most likely to endorse? Détente, containment, nuclear disarmament, or mutually assured destruction? He is going to promote this idea called containment. He doesn't actually say the word in the document, but it is the key idea of American foreign policy between 1946 and roughly, well, the end of the Cold War in 1991, to contain the spread of communism at all costs. And that idea is going to lead to America's involvement in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and a bunch of American involvement in other countries' civil wars during the Cold War era. Now, how do we get this idea of containing communism? Where does this show up? Well, we're going to have to skim. And this idea, this clue that we get, comes here near the end of number 3 here. Much depends on the health and vigor of our own society. World communism is like a malignant parasite which feeds only on diseased tissue. Well, that sounds very nasty, doesn't it? Well, if you imagine that he's saying that communism is something like a cancer that spreads, wouldn't you want to contain that before it kills you? Wouldn't you want to cut that out, or at least give you some pills or something to inject to contain that where it is so you could live? So keep that in mind, the tone that he uses about communism. He thinks communism is evil, it has to be destroyed, but that's where we get our idea of containment. Now, as far as our other distractors are concerned, they're all relevant to the discussion of the Cold War, but here's why they're wrong. The idea of détente between the United States and Soviet Union would not happen for another couple of decades, until the 60s. Détente means a relaxation of tensions. In the 60s and 70s, the United States and Soviet Union actually signed some good treaties, reduce the number of nuclear missiles, cooperate in space, cooperate on the eradication of smallpox in the 60s and 70s. So it was a time of relaxed feelings between the two countries that Kinnan probably would not have agreed about at all. Now, if you think, though, that your enemy is a cancer, are you going to get rid of your nukes? Especially when you know that your enemy is trying to get nuclear weapons? No. You're going to keep your nukes, just in case. Mutually assured destruction? This idea hadn't come up yet for two reasons. One, the Soviet Union had not created an atomic bomb in 1946. That was a couple years down the road. So America had a monopoly on bombs and therefore was still the strongest country on Earth. Now, if you skim your passage, which you should, looking at some key ideas, you don't see the idea of two countries destroying each other. In paragraph 1 talks about Russia's mindset, or the Soviet Union's mindset, Paragraph 2 talks about the same thing, and our final paragraph talks about American strategy. Nowhere in this strategy do we see anything about destroying one another. So, again, even if you're unsure about some of these terms' meanings, you can really use process of elimination to your benefit. You see nothing about C and D, and even if you completely forgot what A, détente, means, you still have a 50-50 chance of getting it right. So, like I said, if you're pushed up against a wall and you're down to 2, guess. You've got a 50-50 shot. You may get it right. Okay. Question 14. Same document, new question. Which of the following describes Kinnan's views about the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union would collapse in a few years. The atomic bomb would intimidate the Soviets. The Soviet Union would retreat if matched firmly. Or negotiating would secure peace with the Soviet Union. They all sound pretty plausible. But the correct answer is C. The Soviet Union would retreat if matched firmly. Where do we see this, though? So, like I said, we're going to skim. Look at some keywords we can take with us, though. Collapse, atomic bomb, matched firmly, and negotiations. Keep those 4 key ideas in your mind as you skim. And as we skim with those key ideas in mind, we are going to find our answer in paragraph 2. And it shows up here. Soviet power, unlike that of Hitlerite Germany, is neither schematic nor adventuristic. It does not work by fixed plans. It does not take unnecessary risks, impervious to logic of reason, and it is highly sensitive to the logic of force. For this reason, it can easily withdraw, and usually does when strong resistance is encountered at any point. He is arguing that the Soviet Union as a whole is less like a person making a rational decision and more like an animal in the wild. If it's aggressive and you respond with force, equal force, it's going to back down, because at that point, let's say a wild animal is attacking another animal, but that animal is strong, the attacker might run away. And that's what Kinnan is arguing here. The Soviet Union will retreat if matched firmly. And that's the idea, like I said, that's going to get the United States involved in Korea and Vietnam. The idea that, well, communism is expanding, and if we use the same amount of force to push back, they're going to stop. Is that going to actually be true? Well, sort of, but that's his idea. Now, again, A, B, and D, we don't see any of this in the document. We don't see any predictions about collapse. We don't see anything about the atomic bomb intimidating the Soviets. And we don't see anything about how negotiations might or might not work. We do see, however, a very strong emphasis on military force and how it can be used to limit the growth of communism and the Soviet Union's power over the world. Okay, question 15 coming up. Same passage. Okay, and one thing I want to say before we get into question 15 is that if you do have a 3-question set, or 2 or 3 question set that is, it's actually to your advantage, because as you're skimming, you're getting an impression about what the document's about, and by the time you get to a question like this, it's probably going to be easier to answer because you've already put in the groundwork of getting that general idea of what the document is saying. So, that said, to what does Kinnan attribute the Soviet Union's foreign policy decisions? So basically, why does the Soviet Union decide what it decides? Is it its military, political, and economic strength, the recent experience of the 2 world wars, a fear of its internal weaknesses and outsiders, the history of betrayal by capitalists and the United States? The correct answer is C, a fear of its internal weaknesses and outsiders. Now, this is one of those questions where knowing a little about history might get you in trouble, because you might think, well, wait a minute, Russia was involved in these wars, that's probably right. But remember, you're basing your answer on the document and not what you know necessarily about history. The GED Social Studies test, remember, is just as much a reading comprehension test as anything else. So we do have to go back to our document just to make sure. So we do get our answer, though, in the first paragraph, and we know that just here, at the bottom of the Kremlin's neurotic view of world affairs. The Kremlin is a reference to the Soviet Union because their capital, their government, is in the Kremlin, which is a fortress in Moscow. So he's basically setting up the idea that the leadership of the Soviet Union is basing their decisions off what we're going to find out in paragraph 1. And let's take a look at the whole thing, just so we make sure we're all on the same page. At the bottom of the Kremlin's neurotic view of world affairs is traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity. Originally, this was insecurity of a peaceful agricultural people trying to live on a vast exposed plain in a neighborhood of fierce nomadic peoples. So, Kinnan's giving a little history lesson, saying hundreds of years ago there were some farmers, and they were always threatened by nomadic peoples. First it was the Mongols, then it was other invaders, so on and so forth. To this was added, as Russia came into contact with the economically advanced West, we're talking about maybe Germany and France and England, fear of more competent, more powerful, more highly organized societies. So these farmers in Russia suddenly realized, hey, a couple hundred miles to the west, there are people that are a lot more advanced than us. That's scary. But this latter type of insecurity was one which afflicted rather Russian rulers than the Russian people, for Russian rulers have invariably sensed that their rule was relatively archaic in the form of fragile and artificial in its psychological foundation, unable to stand comparison or contact with political systems of Western countries. So it's a bit of a hard read, but basically what he's saying is that Russian rulers understood that their way of doing things was so far behind the rest of the Western world, it made them feel inferior. And for this reason, long story short, Russia tries to catch up in the 18th and 19th centuries with new reforms, things like that. But this insecurity of this fear See, this is the emotion that we see the connection between paragraph 1 and the correct answer. Fear, insecurity, this fear of outsiders, the idea that I'm inferior as a ruler because I do things a different way than people in the West. This is the attitude Kennan believes is influencing all of the Soviet Union's foreign policy. Granted, the Soviet Union is different than Imperial Russia, but Kennan's arguing, yeah, the name of the country might have changed, but at its core, it's the same group of people and the same weaknesses and the same ideas that are influencing their country. This fear of internal weaknesses and outsiders. All right, that said, let us move on to question 16. Okay, question 16. Dealing with a new category, individual rights and civic responsibilities. Looks like we have a picture and some text. And let's take a look at our question. Someone sitting in one of the 12 chairs on the left side of the image of a courtroom is performing a civic duty, civil right, civil liberty, or civic opportunity. The correct answer is A, civic duty. Now, what is civic duty? A civic duty is a responsibility that citizens have towards their government. And in this case, as we take a look at our picture, we see a courtroom. That's where the judge sits. That's where witnesses sit. And on this side here, we see a number of chairs. We don't see all of them, but there are 12 in total. And this is where the jury sits. Now, why is jury duty a civic responsibility? Now, in our Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, it says that people have the right to a jury trial. And a jury of your peers, meaning you, me, someone you've never met, you come together, chosen by the government, to hear the facts of the case and rule. Guilty, not guilty. Now, it is a duty rather than an option, because if you don't do jury duty, you could be fined, you could be put in prison. There are laws about this. And also sometimes that's very inconvenient, but it is your duty as an American citizen to do this if called upon. All adults may be called upon where they live. Now, as far as the others are concerned, let's hop down right actually to see. Civil liberties are what it says in the Bill of Rights. Those civil liberties people have to protect them against the government. Civil rights are the equal application of civil liberties. When we talk about the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, we see groups like African Americans, Native Americans, and women saying, hey, we want our civil liberties too. The Constitution says we get them, but the way people treat us, it's not right. We want these civil rights like white men have in American society, the equal application of their civil liberties. Now, and civic opportunity, that really doesn't apply. But if you needed an example, that would probably be something like volunteering at a food bank, helping out your community, an option rather than a duty, which is jury duty. Okay, question 17. Same picture, same passage, new question. One thing to note about these kinds of questions on the GED Social Studies test, if you see 2 or 3 questions, you might see one just about the image we saw before. You might see one just about the text. And sometimes, maybe not here, but on the actual GED, you'll see a question that asks you to pull information from the picture and the text. So keep that in mind going forward. Okay, in our question 17, from which founding document does the text come? The Bill of Rights, the Federalist Papers, the Articles of Confederation, or the Declaration of Independence? The answer is A, the Bill of Rights. What we see here, these 2 paragraphs, this comes from the 6th Amendment. It's the right to a trial. And the 7th Amendment is the right to a jury trial. Now, if you skim these, you should know right away, okay, these are rights that I'm familiar with. These are things that relate to this image. And they are set down in the Bill of Rights, the rule book about the rights people have. They are preserved for the people forever. The government can't take them away. of course, unless there was another constitutional amendment. So the Bill of Rights give you the right to a jury trial. You'd probably, if you were on trial, you'd probably be sitting over here on the right side of the image, and your peers would judge you. Now, that said, let's take a look at our distractors. The Federalist Papers were written in the 1780s. Excuse me, I had to think about that one for a second. 1780s. And they were arguing for the new Constitution, which was just proposed at the time. It hadn't been ratified yet. It was arguing for the Constitution. The Anti-Federalist Papers argued against it. The Articles of Confederation were the first frame of government the United States had during and just after the American Revolution. It bound the states together very loosely as a confederation of independent states. It had a very weak central government, like I've explained before, and that's why the founders said, hey, we probably got to replace this, and that's why the Constitution happened. The Declaration of Independence, as we've mentioned earlier in the test, written 1776, and created the official break between Great Britain and its American colonies. Okay. Moving on to question 18. All right, we have our third question about this set. Let's see what's happening now. Which statement best describes the text? Are they powers of the court, rights of the victims, rights of the defendants, or the powers of government? They are C, rights of the defendants. If I'm accused of a crime, the Sixth Amendment says, I get a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state, in the same state where the crime committed. So it's laying the groundwork. This is, even if you did the most horrible thing ever, you get a trial, you get it with a jury, with an impartial jury, and you get to know the cause of my accusation. I can confront my witnesses. They have to testify against me in open court. Maybe it's someone that I harmed. Maybe it's someone who saw the crime. They have to be there. So these rules protect me as a defendant. Same thing here. Even though the word jury is mentioned here, it's actually reinforced here by saying in suits of common law. Now, when I say common law, I don't mean criminal law. I mean civil law, as in I want to sue my neighbor over something, for instance, or someone wronged me financially, rather than someone maybe tried to kill me. That's kind of the difference, long story short. Now, when the value exceeds $20, that doesn't seem like much today, but back then it was a ton, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved. So what this is saying, in this situation, if the argument is over $20, you can have a jury trial. That is your right as a defendant. So, that said, both of these amendments make sure that defendants' rights are protected. Now, court powers, and rights of the victims, and the powers of government are in other documents. Some of these powers are described in the Constitution, like D, but they're done so in other places. Rights of the victims, they are codified in law at the state and local levels. Powers of the court, it depends on which court. This Constitution gives the Supreme Court powers, but local courts, maybe the one you're on a jury, for instance, your state gives them specific powers. So these two paragraphs all about defendants' rights. Okay, question 19. Okay, our first bar graph. And we're talking about macroeconomics. That's economics on a big scale, like national and international scale. The chart above supports which of the following conclusions? The unemployment rate rose in 2009 and 2020. There were more imports than exports in the 90s. The American people like times of high GDP growth. And the U.S. economy was relatively stable in 1991 and 2008. The correct answer in this case, everybody, is A. The unemployment rate rose in 2009 and 2020. How do we know this? Well, to get answers like this correct, what you're going to have to do with a bar graph or any kind of graph is compare the statement to what the graph says. So, let's get our right answer first. In 2009 and 2020, gross domestic product shrank. The national economy actually got smaller those years. In 2009, it was because of the Great Recession, and you probably remember 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic really, really hurt the economy. Now, when GDP contracts, one of the things that happens is that businesses go out of business. There are fewer jobs, and people who were employed suddenly are no longer employed. Thus, the unemployment rate in both of these years grew tremendously. Sometimes in 2020 it was more temporary, and it took a little longer to recover in 2009. Now, let's look at the others. Let's explain a little bit about macroeconomics and make sure that you understand. There were more imports than exports in the 90s. Well, in the 90s, America was doing pretty good economically, except a little blip here. We had a lot of good growth these years. Now, you would think that maybe this could be true, but here's something to remember. When GDP is high, America is making more things for people to buy, both in America and abroad. So in times of high growth, it actually makes more sense that it makes sense that there's going to be more exports instead of imports. So if this one was switched, it could be correct. Could be, but since it's not, it's definitely wrong. The American people like times of high GDP growth? Well, yeah, they do, but the chart doesn't support that. If the chart was talking about maybe an opinion poll, for instance, about people's thoughts about the economy, that could be right. But remember, you have to get your right answer from what the text or the chart or the graph is telling you. And for that reason, C is incorrect. The U.S. economy was relatively stable in 1991 and 2008. Let's take a look at those years. In 91, it looks like the GDP fell just a little bit, and in 2008, it looks like it rose just a little bit, so almost the same. You would think, wait a minute, yeah, stable, it's right on the line. No. If the economy doesn't grow, let's say it's 0% growth, you got to remember, every year there's always more people in the United States looking for jobs. More people graduate high school or college than the year before, and they're going to want an open job to apply to. If the economy doesn't grow, there are no new jobs. And if there are no new jobs, the economy's not stable. It's not doing good at all. So a stable economy is these high numbers here. Anything above 2 or 3% growth, that's a stable economy. That's the economy you want to live in. So that said, these three distractors are 100% incorrect, and the unemployment rate did rise in these two time periods, 2009 and 2020. All right, question 20 coming up. Same graph. Now, some questions on the GED Social Studies tests may ask you to look at a graph, but may not refer to it directly. It may talk about a similar idea, though, and that's what we see exactly in this question. Economists leave out which economic information when calculating GDP. So it's asking you to consider the very people who make graphs like this. What information are they using, and which information do they leave out? So you do not need to look at the graph for this. So let's take a look at our options. Question 20. Consumer spending, financial transactions, the market prices for goods, or the amount of goods produced. These are all parts of our economy. The thing they leave out is financial transactions. When I say a financial transaction, I mean primarily the selling of stocks. When you sell a stock, you just show transfer of ownership. There's no new production. Nothing physical is being made. The other three options here, are all about you and me in the marketplace, buying things, selling things. We look at how much produce is in the grocery store. That would be the market prices. We look at how many, the economists, look at how many cars are produced in the United States, how many cars are sold. So we're talking more about physical items here and things people need to survive. Stocks, like I said, There's nothing really there. It's just a piece of paper that keeps going back and forth. People sell it, people buy it, people sell it, people buy it. And that's why it's not used in calculating GDP. So if you make a lot of money on the stock market this year, congratulations. But economists are not looking at that when thinking about the health of the economy. Okay, question 21. All right, same graph. A related question, another question though we do not need this for. GDP growth results in which of the following outcomes? Deflation, increased wages, more production, or no unemployment? The answer is B, increased wages. When you have a growing economy, one of the first things that happens is inflation. Things become a little bit more expensive for a few reasons, mainly because the flow of money throughout the economy is going faster than before. Now, since I already mentioned inflation is going up in a good economy, deflation's obviously not correct. So keep that in mind. But back to our right answer. When things become more expensive, companies have to react. They have to increase their wages to stay competitive, to keep their employees happy. So that's the reason why if you work a job for a number of years, you might get a small raise every year for cost of living in a healthy economy. In a bad economy, you may not, because there's less of a need for it, because inflation that happens isn't happening as much. More production will actually lead to GDP growth. And so you're getting things mixed up with C. More production causes this, and it's not a cause of high GDP growth. Companies making more stuff causes the GDP to rise. Last but not least, in a good economy, unemployment's going to become very small. There's going to be more jobs, and fewer people will be unemployed. But there will never be a time when there's zero unemployment. There's always someone who's going to be laid off, or looking for a job, or have simply given up and said, I can't find a job, I'm going to step out of the labor pool for a while, or maybe go back to school. So D is obviously incorrect. So, first outcome in a good market, inflation happens, and then employers have to increase wages. Okay, question 22. Looks like we have some boxes and some blanks. So, in a situation like this, first of all, our category is types of government. For question 22, we see there's a blank for A, and we see, the nobility holds all the power. Direct democracy, nothing. Constitutional democracy, a constitution establishes the organization of government. Dictatorship, and a single person holds all the power. This looks like different types of governments, and this looks like descriptions. So when you see an image like this, a small table, take a moment to get the basic idea of what it's talking about, and then go to our question. Which term would best go at the top of column A? Monarchy, oligarchy, constitutional monarchy, or representative democracy? The correct answer is B, oligarchy. In an oligarchy, there is a small number of people. It could be rich people. It could be a small group of politicians, just a small group. They have all the power, and collectively they make decisions. In a monarchy, it's just one person, the king, queen, or emperor. In a constitutional monarchy, the king or queen has a little bit of power, but most of the power lies with Parliament, and this is what happens in Great Britain, for instance. The king or queen has a few government roles, but the Parliament basically does 99% of the work and has 99.9% of the power. In a representative democracy like ours, citizens over the age of 18 vote for representatives in the Senate and the House, and also for the president, and they let the people that win these elections make decisions for them. So, oligarchy, the nobility has all the power. Question 23. If each column featured an example of a political leader from history, which one would best go in column D? Dictatorship. Adolf Hitler, Barack Obama, Nelson Mandela, or Winston Churchill? If you know your history, this one shouldn't be hard. The answer is A, Adolf Hitler, who ruled as Germany's dictator between 1933 and 1945. Now, with him, he held all the power. His government, they did have a parliament, but they basically did what he said. He or someone else close to him would write up a bill, he would send it over, they would put their stamp on it, and they had to because violence would happen against them if they didn't. So in a dictatorship, one person runs the show, and that's what Hitler did for 12 years. In Barack Obama and Nelson Mandela's case, they were elected by representative democracies. In the United States in 2008, that's when Obama was elected, and in South Africa, Nelson Mandela became the country's first black leader in 1994. Winston Churchill was under a constitutional monarchy. He was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during World War II and for a period shortly after the war. So, in questions like this, sometimes it's easy, sometimes you'll know right away, but always take a look at your other options, even if you're 99.9% sure. It'll do you a lot of good, especially if you're doing good with your time at this part of the social studies test. Okay, moving on. Question 24. Same table. What information would go in best in column B? This blank here. All eligible citizens vote on bills. The government does not have written laws. Citizens elect representatives to vote on bills, or power flows from the government to the people. The answer is A. All eligible citizens in a direct democracy vote on bills. Direct democracy was the first form of democracy the ancient Greeks invented over 2,000 years ago. All men who were not slaves would gather and discuss the issues of the day affecting their city, and they would cast votes using clay shards with their name. One color meant yes, another color meant no. So this was a very big part of ancient Greek life. Now granted, back then these cities were relatively small, so getting everyone together who could vote wasn't a big deal. For a country like ours, you may understand why a direct democracy may not be the best idea. But for them, it was, and that's what direct democracy is. Now, this idea here, you can throw it away. All governments, the governments listed here and governments not, they all have written laws. They all need to keep things organized. So that's completely incorrect. Citizens elect representatives to vote on bills? Well, remember from our last question, that's representative democracy. That's when you choose someone to represent you in Congress or as president. And power flows from the government to the people? Well, that's not democracy. In democracy, the power is held by the people. What the people decide to use with that power, maybe a direct democracy or a representative democracy, that's their decision. But D, it's all reversed, so we know that's incorrect. Okay, question 25. Looks like we have a short passage, and we're talking about the principles of American constitutional democracy. So, like I said, we don't read the passage first, but if you do see something like an attribution line, always take a look at it so you get an idea maybe of what you're talking about. We're talking about the writer, the French philosopher Montesquieu, and his important work, The Spirit of the Laws, which he published about, nearly 30 years before the American Revolution. From what principle of American constitutional democracy does Montesquieu advocate? Federalism, constitutionalism, checks and balances, or the separation of powers? Montesquieu was a big believer in B, the separation of powers, something that we see in our own government with its three branches, the executive, the legislative, and judicial. So, where do we see that, though? Let's take a look at our very first paragraph, and you'll see the answer is right there. When the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or in the same body of magistrates, there can be no liberty, because apprehensions may arise, lest the same monarch or senate should enact tyrannical laws to execute them in a tyrannical manner. He's basically arguing if one person has all the power, that person can, if that person's evil, things are going to go very bad very quick. So separating the powers between different people or different political bodies is a really good idea. And that's something the United States is going to learn from and say, hey, we should give that a try. That's going to protect our country from being a tyranny. Okay. Before we go on, let's take a look at these other three really quick. Now, checks and balances is related to the separation of powers, but it's different because it discusses how those powers interact. In our country, each of the three federal branches can check the power of others in different ways. For instance, the executive branch, which is the president, can nominate Supreme Court justices, but the Senate, which is part of the legislative branch, has to approve them. So the president says, I want this person on the Supreme Court, and if that person is, let's say, evil, for instance, the Senate can say no. And that's an example of checks and balances. Constitutionalism was an idea that had already existed long before Montesquieu, but we don't see any idea here of writing a document. He's not telling people you need to write down all your laws. So we know that's incorrect. Federalism discusses the relationship between the federal government and the state governments. And even though he's talking about government in this passage, he's not discussing that difference between the central federal government and the state governments. So keep that in mind. Use that process of elimination, and you will get to executive powers. Separation of powers. 26. Which branch of the government enforces laws? This is one of the questions, again, you'll see from time to time, that's about the passage, but you don't need it to answer it. Is it the judicial, federal, executive, or legislative branch? The answer is executive. Let's think back to our discussion on the three branches of government. The legislative branch writes laws. The judicial branch judges whether those laws are constitutional, and they can strike them down if necessary. The executive branch, the president, is supposed to make sure that the laws Congress passes are enacted and enforced at the federal level. The president does this in a couple ways. They can create a cabinet with different departments. Those departments oversee certain areas within the law that Congress has passed to enact those laws. It may be a federal agency. For example, about 50 years ago, Congress passed the Clean Air Act and other environmental laws. And the executive branch created the Environmental Protection Agency as a result to make sure those laws were followed by people throughout the United States. So in this role, the president has many roles, but the president in this case is making sure that the laws Congress passes actually happen, that people actually follow them. So that's one of the main roles of the president. Okay, question 27. Another vocab question. In the context of paragraph 2, what does Montesquieu mean by arbitrary? Let's take a look. The whole paragraph. Again, there is no liberty if the judiciary power be not separate from the legislative and the executive. Were it joined with the legislative, and the life and liberty of the subject would be exposed to arbitrary control, for the judge would then be the legislator. Were it joined to the executive power, the judge might behave with violence and oppression. Okay. Now that we know that, we should see the correct answer is D. Despotic. They're acting like a dictator. And the reason we know this through reading paragraph 2 is at the very end. If person is given arbitrary control, they're going to react with violence and oppression to make sure they never lose that power. Because absolute power corrupts, absolutely. You might have heard that expression. So that said, we can use that part of the passage to rule out A and B, because someone who is violent is not wise or steady. And it has really nothing about foolish. The person who is a despot is not foolish. They're evil. What they're doing you may think is foolish, but they are acting as a dictator, and that's why despotic is the correct answer. Okay. Question 28. Looks like we got a pie chart, not telling us anything really, but it's just a picture. And we're talking about global connections, cultures, and society. The pie chart above would work best, displaying what kind of information about a country. Okay. Its trade deficit, its trade surplus, spending in a single year, or economic growth over time. It would show us spending in a single year best over any of the other three. And here's why. Imagine our pie chart here had these three categories, for instance, were the army, healthcare, and let's say this one was education. So let's say that's all you spent in a year. You could tell really quickly which one was the biggest slice and what the government's spending priorities were. The real pie chart for our country has about 100 plus slices to it. Some big, like defense, some small, like space exploration, NASA, for instance. So seeing that real pie chart would let you know immediately, okay, this is what our country values more and how we're spending our money, what takes priority. A, B, and D would more likely work with line graphs or bar graphs. That would show changes over time. So your x-axis, the floor, would have the years, for instance, and the y-axis going up and down would have the amount of money spent. So you could show that relationship over time. A pie chart can't do that. So when it says single year, that's your key, really, to understand why the pie chart works best. Because if you're talking about over time or relationships with other countries, you need a different way to show that information. So that's the reason why C is correct. Question 29. Going back to documents, we're talking about economics through history. And we know from the top that this is a letter to Eli Whitney, a very famous American inventor. And it was written by Thomas Jefferson a couple of years before he became president, 1793. What was the impact of the technological development described in the letter? Farming became more efficient. Slavery became less lucrative than before. The federal government founded cotton farms throughout the nation. Or enslaved people became less important to the growing and harvesting of cotton. The correct answer is A. Farming becomes much more efficient after Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin. How do we know he invents the cotton gin? Well, it says it in the very first line. Sir, your favor of October 15th, enclosing a drawing of your cotton gin. This is the subject of the letter. And we're trying to think, okay, we're talking about the cotton gin. That's all we need. What's the impact of this? So, how does this one invention make cotton farming more efficient? Before its invention, imagine a field of cotton. You would have African slaves or their descendants picking it. That did not change because of this invention. But here's what did. Before the cotton gin, slaves would have to sit for many hours using hand tools to pick the seeds out of the cotton balls. Now, this was a time-intensive process. The seeds were very sticky, they were hard to get out, and it took a lot of people a lot of time to do it. And that's what made cotton pretty expensive to farm, because you had to have someone basically doing this all day. A cotton gin took hours of work and turned it into minutes of work. It made those hand tools that I was mentioning completely obsolete, and it made cotton available. It made cotton cheaper and more available to many more people. Now, why aren't the other three correct? You would think, well, wait a minute, if I need fewer slaves, wouldn't it be less lucrative? No, and here's why. If you can turn cotton from the field into cotton you can sell really quickly, you're going to need more slaves to pick all of that cotton. You want bigger farms. You want more slaves picking cotton. They're still picking cotton by hand, but if they throw it into the machine, it's good to go in just a couple minutes. So slavery is going to become more lucrative because we need more slaves to pick more cotton. C is incorrect because the federal government never did this. You might think it's correct because maybe it makes sense. You know, Eli Whitney and Thomas Jefferson have this relationship, and Thomas Jefferson's going to be president. But it's not correct at all. And D, enslaved people became less important for the growing and harvesting of cotton. Well, like I said, yeah, you no longer had to have enslaved people picking the seeds out, but you need a lot more enslaved people to grow it because you're making so much more. Remember, because you can make more cotton, the price of cotton starts to fall because you can make more of it. And to make your money back, you need even more cotton. I know this sounds strange, but you need more enslaved people to do this. And one of the things to keep in mind when Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin, one of his thoughts is, oh, this is going to make slavery less important to the South because they've got this machine. And it's actually ironic that it actually had the opposite effect because it led to the creation of these cotton plantations that were 10,000 acres with hundreds, maybe thousands of slaves picking cotton for one owner, for one factory farm, so to speak. So efficiency led to this explosion of slavery in the South and the cotton plantations that we're familiar with learning about the South. Okay. Question 30. Same idea, same passage, but it's a question that's just related. We don't need to go back to the passage. The blank ensured that the technological development described in the letter could be produced in the large quantities, the technological development being the cotton gin. The American system, the agricultural system, the Industrial Revolution, or the American Revolution. The correct answer in this case is the Industrial Revolution. In 1793, the United States, North or South, was a very agrarian country. Farms everywhere. But over in England, some advances were happening. People were starting to use steam to run small machines. The idea that a steam-powered machine could give power to a factory, not electric power, but movement power, that could run things like looms and other devices that could make things where people made them in the past. When this technology comes over to the United States in the next decade or two after 1793, factories start popping up in the North. And what do Southern plantation owners order? Cotton gins. You got to have a lot of material and people to put these things together, or they make the parts, they ship them down south, and the people on site put it together. But without factories, you couldn't produce cotton gins in a large amount. So the Industrial Revolution, despite causing a rift between North and South, actually helps the South reinforce its agricultural system with this important machine. It doesn't produce it, but it needs it. And the Industrial Revolution leads to the production of that and textile development and many other advances throughout the world. Okay, so moving on. Question 31. New passage, and now we're talking about economics throughout history. And we have a blank. Let's take a look. Oh, before we take a look at our question, always look at your attribution line. Ann O. Kruger, First Deputy Managing Director, International Monetary Fund, 2002. So this is a fairly recent document. Okay, what word best completes the blank in the source? Trade, technology, colonization, or globalization? The correct answer is D, globalization. To get the right answer in a situation like this, as we've seen before, we have to look for context clues, and let's do that. Like any process, blank has been subject to ebbs and flows. It gained impetus during the period of the great discoveries of the 15th century and in later centuries from dramatic falls in the cost of communication and transportation. For instance, the fortunes of the House of Rothschild were helped by their being the first to use carrier pigeons to carry business news between London and Brussels. The invention of the telegraph and the laying of the transatlantic cable cut settlement times between New York and London from 10 days to 3. Stop and think about what it must have been like when the first telegraph wire went through. It must have been as big a breakthrough as the ones in more recent times that we rave about. Using the process of elimination and trying each word in the blank can help you here. But here's why globalization is correct, though, first. Globalization is, in one sense of the word, making the world a smaller place. Every time that you chat with someone on the other side of the world using your computer, or even just send a piece of mail that gets to the other side of the world in 3 or 4 days, people are able to communicate faster and do business like ever before, and we are interdependent on one another. That's another meaning of globalization. So, as we see here, the House of Rothschild, a very important banking house, was able to do business transactions by carrier pigeon instead of sending a guy on a boat across the English Channel between London and Brussels. Also, the telegraph allowed communications between England and the United States in a matter of seconds when it would have taken weeks. So the world's getting smaller. If you keep that in mind about globalization, how people are becoming more interconnected, there's your answer. Keep that idea in mind about globalization. Now, trade and technology certainly play a role in all of this. Trade has always happened, but just because you have trade doesn't mean you have globalization. Technology is the same thing. In our previous document about the cotton gin, well, that was technology, but that didn't bring the world together. It made a lot of plantation owners in the South very, very rich. Colonization was happening in the 19th century, but again, that's not bringing the world together. It's not making communication easier. It's just conquering other countries. Now, for those reasons, process of elimination can get you the right answer, but like I said, keep globalization and the basic ideas in mind, and you will get a question like this correct 100% of the time. Okay, question 32. It looks like we have a part of the Constitution, Article 3, Section 1. How long does a justice serve on the Supreme Court? A life term, a 10-year term, as long as a presidential term, as long as the same political party controls Congress. The answer is A life term. A justice on the Supreme Court can stay there until his or her dying day or retire at any time. That is actually part of the Constitution, as we see here. We see it right here in this sentence. The judges, both of the Supreme and inferior courts, shall hold their offices during good behavior. We can unpack that a little bit, but it basically says, as long as they're doing a good job, they can stay forever. And a lot of justices have. The last justice to actually have died in office was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and before her, Antonin Scalia. A lot of justices, though, retire due to either health reasons or they believe they no longer can do the job well, or other reasons. There's a few. But they're on there for life if they want. Looking at our distractors, there is no government post with a 10-year term, so that one's completely wrong. As long as a presidential term, which is 2 terms, that would be about 8 years. No, that's not it either. And as long as the same political party controls Congress. Now, this one is a bit tricky. This is probably the one that might trip you up, because here's the idea. Let's say a Supreme Court justice is approved by the Senate, and the Senate at that time was Democratic. That's the Democratic Party had the Senate in their control. Let's say the next election happens, though, and the Republican Party comes in. Oh, they don't like this new justice. They don't like his or her opinions. Even if the party controls Congress, the House, and the Senate, there are rules in the Constitution about impeaching justices and removing them that means you would need 2/3 of the Senate to get rid of them. There has rarely been an opportunity in American political history where any party had that many votes. And even if they did, no Supreme Court justice has ever been removed through impeachment. So you can safely put away answer choice D and say, yep, they are there for life, and that's just how it is. Question 33. What is the title of the spokesperson of the Supreme Court? Another question that's about a general idea and not directly related. I'm sorry, it is directly related to our passage, but we don't need it to get the right answer. Is it the Chief Justice, the Attorney General, the Commander-in-Chief, or the Speaker of the House? The correct answer is the Chief Justice. Now, all of the 9 men and women on the Supreme Court are justices, and the Chief Justice has specific duties that the other justices do not have. One of the things the Chief Justice does is that after they have a vote on a case, the Chief Justice says, okay, well, this other tells another justice to, you're going to be the one who writes the majority opinion, and you're going to be the one who writes the minority opinion. The Chief Justice can't tell people to change their minds. Their vote counts the exact same as the other 8 justices' votes. But like I said, they sort of rule the little procedural things in the background. And if you were to see the Supreme Court justices in the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice would be sitting in the very middle. Also, one other thing the Chief Justice does, just for your information, is if there is an impeachment trial against the President of the United States, the Chief Justice oversees the proceedings, as much a judge on any trial would. They have that same role. So, like I said, their vote counts the exact same, but they do have other duties and are seen as the spokesperson and head of the Supreme Court. Question 34. Microeconomics, and it looks like we have a scenario here. This is not a actual document. This was something created for the test, which you will likely see once or twice on the real GED. And let's take a look at our question first, as always. The minimum wage Sam receives for his work is a price control, ensures that skilled laborers are paid fairly, injects money into the circular flow of goods and services, or is necessary because of supply and demand for workers. The answer is A, a price control. Now, the first thing you do in a situation like this where you're given a scenario rather than a document is actually to read the scenario, especially considering how short it is. Let's take a look. Sam hasn't been doing too great lately. He's working a minimum wage job sweeping up the local fast food restaurant. And to make things worse, the blank told him they're raising his APR. That means more money out of his pocket every month. Sighing, Sam gets online to look for a second job. Now we see minimum wage here, and that he's working at a fast food restaurant where he makes this wage. Now, a price control, is a restriction governments place on businesses regarding the prices for goods and services. In this case, the price control is telling businesses, you cannot pay for Sam's labor at a rate below what we tell you. The current minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, I believe, and that's a price control the government puts on all businesses in the United States, saying it is illegal for you to pay anyone lower than this per hour. So, for that reason, minimum wage equals price control. Let's look at these others. So maybe you're having trouble with microeconomics and you need a little process of elimination. B, unfortunately, the minimum wage does not ensure that skilled laborers are paid fairly. The minimum wage, if you turn that into an annual wage, it would be about $15,000 a year if you worked 50 weeks, 40 hours a week. No one can survive on that, so that is not fair. A minimum wage does not inject money into the circular flow of goods and services because it's only when Sam spends that money does this happen. So it's missing a step for C, and that's why it's incorrect. And is it necessary because of supply and demand for workers? No. If there was no minimum wage, and remember, most of American history happened without a minimum wage, there was always supply and demand for workers. Unfortunately, during those times, workers, even workers who were not enslaved, made ridiculously low prices because of the manipulation by business owners. And that's one of the reasons why we do have a minimum wage in this country. Okay. Question 35. What phrase goes best in the blank in the passage? Debit card company, credit card company, Internal Revenue Service, Social Security Administration. The correct answer is B, credit card company. Now, let's say Sam, he's working this minimum wage job. He can't afford a lot of things. So he's had to use his credit card to buy things he needs. And he has a lot of debt, unfortunately. His credit card company is telling him they're raising his APR, his annual percentage rate. That's the percentage of interest he pays on his bill. Let's say Sam took out $1,000 and his interest rate is, his APR, is 25%. That means by the end of the year, if Sam didn't pay his bill at all, he would now owe $1,250. So interest rates going up usually mean higher payments, and that's why he has more money out of his pocket every month. He has to pay more to cover his bills for his credit card, and that's why he needs to look for a second job. He needs more money to pay his bills. So as far as the others are concerned, debit card companies, if you have a debit card, you pay with your own money, and when you run out, the card no longer works. You don't go into debt. The Internal Revenue Service has nothing to do with credit cards. It has nothing to do, you can't go into debt with the Internal Revenue Service unless you haven't paid your taxes. And they don't use things like APR to determine how much you owe them. Let's say if you miss paying your taxes, you will pay a fine if you do not pay your taxes for a year and they find out, but they don't use APR to calculate that. The Social Security Administration doesn't use this either. Now, if they actually raised something, maybe raised a payment, if Sam, let's say, was a senior citizen who was working, if they raised his payments, he wouldn't need to look for another job because he'd have more money every month instead of having less money. So credit card companies, remember every credit card ad you've ever seen, it'll always have something in it that says this is our APR, this is how much interest you will pay, and unfortunately, like Sam, if that percentage goes up, you're paying more every month to cover your bills. So that's why Sam needs another job. Okay. Question 36. We have a picture, and our category is World Geography, Human/Environment Interaction. Which of the following is a direct result of deforestation? Acid rain, air and water pollution, increased use of resources, or more carbon dioxide in the air? The correct answer is D, a direct result of deforestation. The very first thing that happens is there's more carbon dioxide in the air. How do we know that? The picture gives us two clues. If we look at here, we see a large area where trees have been cut down. Fewer trees means there are fewer ways for the environment to suck up carbon dioxide. Because remember, plants suck up carbon dioxide and they release oxygen. That's part of the carbon cycle. Now, if there's fewer trees, it means there's more CO2, carbon dioxide molecules floating up in the air. Now, another thing that leads to higher carbon dioxide, as we can see in the image, there's actually burning happening. You see the smoke here, and I believe here too. When you burn something, that releases stored carbon dioxide in the plant back into the air. So deforestation, it automatically goes into the air, and the carbon dioxide up in the air that's there can't find new places to go on Earth. And that's why it's the direct result. It's the very first thing that happens when you deforest a rainforest or something else. A, B, and C are also things that can happen, but they happen further down the line. Let's say, for instance, that in this empty space here, the people put a factory that spews a bunch of even worse chemicals into the air. That can lead to acid rain and air and water pollution right away. If the factory here is making cars, it needs resources like steel, silicon, rubber to make a car. We're going to use more resources. But remember, A, B, and C, they're all happening much later. That's the next decision people make that can hurt the environment. When they cut down trees, carbon dioxide levels rise. That's the first thing. Global connections, cultures, and society, and it looks like we have a map of Europe. The map is the best geographic tool to show which of the following: economic growth, population migration statistics, landmarks popular with tourists, or the breakdown of ethnic groups in different areas. The answer is C, landmarks popular with tourists. If you've ever been on a trip, local or otherwise, imagine you're in a hotel for a night or two. By the reception desks, there's usually a large display with pamphlets of local attractions that have maps. It may not be a map of Europe, it may be a map of a small town, and it'll say, hey, if you go here, there's a little dot, oh, this is the world's largest ball of twine, and over here we have the world's largest frying pan, or something like that. But if you're going to Europe, and let's say you had a map that looked very much like this, you might see a dot beside Paris that says, oh, the Palace of Versailles, or a dot up in England that says Stonehenge. Oh, that'd be a nice place to go. That's where tourists like to go. Maybe I want to go there too. So having a map like this and having more dots for the tourist attractions, it would teach people immediately where to go to see those attractions. So, but when it comes to A, B, and D, well, you could use other tools better. Let me tell you how. A and B, for instance, would work with a line graph or a bar graph, like we saw earlier in the test. We saw a bar graph about GDP growth, economic growth. That would work best there. Population migration statistics, well, you could use a bar or line graph there too. Or, for D, the breakdown of ethnic groups in different areas, you could use pie charts. Now, for instance, though, sometimes geographic tools get combined. You could technically use D with a map like this, but, and here's the reason it's still wrong, you would have to overlay pie charts on every country. And this obviously would have to be a much bigger map so you could see it clearly with each country's pie chart about where immigrants are coming from. Or I'm sorry, what ethnic groups the country has. So France might have a little pie chart here that says maybe 90% born in France, 10% from another country, for instance. But simply put, this is best used as a traditional map showing landmarks with tourists. Again, these two line charts, bar charts, line graphs and bar graphs, and the pie chart for D. All right, we're still talking about our map. And it says someone immigrating from France to Spain would need to cross the blank: the Tagus River, the Danube River, the Pyrenees Mountains, or the Carpathian Mountains. The answer is C, the Pyrenees Mountains. Now, if you're looking at this on the practice test or a similar practice test and you think it might be a little small or possibly a little blurry, please rest assured on the actual GED the maps are always going to be very large and very clear. So don't think that everything you see on a practice test, the quality of an image, for instance, is going to reflect the real thing. But what you can see between France and Spain here is the word Pyrenees. And even if it didn't say mountains, you could say, there's the word, there's the answer, correct answer, moving on. Another thing to note, before we do move on to the next question, is you should know, as you can see on this map, is that the blue lines do indicate rivers. So it shows you major river systems throughout Europe, including the Danube River and our other river we were mentioning here, and the Carpathian Mountains, which are in this general area. Now, the Pyrenees Mountains, a little bit of history about them. France and Spain, because of this mountain chain here, these two countries have had a very stable border for over 1,000 years. It's the natural border. It's hard to cross, and it's just this natural dividing line between the two countries. If you took a while and looked at a map of Europe, you would see how rivers and mountains play that role really well. For instance, part of the French and German border is divided by a river. A mountain chain divides some of the countries in this general area too, and that has been a big part of European history, drawing borders based off natural boundaries. So keep that in mind going forward. And the Pyrenees Mountains separate France and Spain. Moving on. Question 39. All right, we have a political campaigns and elections in American politics question. And our source is titled Building a Stronger, Fairer Economy. Which type of organization most likely produced the source? A lobbying firm, a political party, an interest group, or an electoral college? The answer is a political party. And in this case, this is from the Democratic Party, as we see here. Now, what this paragraph does, if you do, like I said, you should always skim. But once you've skimmed, the conclusion, the ideas that you see here are talking about ideas very broadly. We're founding a new social and economic contract with the American people, one that increases prosperity. Let's just skip down. A new economic contract that provides access to affordable banking and financial services. We see very broad ideas here. We don't see a specific plan. We don't say we're going to do this in steps A, B, C, D, and so on. But a political party will create a source like this to tell potential voters, these are our positions. This is what we want to do when we're in power. Now, how can we figure out it's a political party versus the other three? Well, A and C, lobbying firms, the men and women who go to people in Congress and try to sell their ideas about different political positions, and interest groups that do the same thing on a larger scale, they're actually going to be the ones that come up with that larger plan, that are going to tell their congressperson, we have written a proposed bill that you may want to propose in Congress, laying out what this idea is, A, B, C, D, E. And a member of that political party may say, yeah, I'm going to look at this, I might make a few changes, or I might just take what you wrote and submit it on the floor of the House of Representatives or the floor of the Senate. So political parties always start with these broad ideas, and it's these other groups a lot of the time that bring them into focus and say, how are we going to get from this idea and turn it into a reality through legislation? D, though, is obviously incorrect because the Electoral College only has one specific role, which is to elect the President of the United States based off each state's popular vote in the presidential election. And in case you're a little hazy on the Electoral College, remember, in my state, California, and every state, whichever candidate wins just one vote more than 50% of the popular vote, so 50.000001%, they get all of that state's electoral votes. So D is an outlier for that reason. Question 40, same passage. How could the group who produced the source turn its ideas into results for the American people? Okay, we're talking about that idea again. How do we go from broad ideas to reality? Through hearings, through elections, through public policy, or through campaign speeches? Public policy is the missing gap between idea and reality. Let's talk about how public policy works. There are many interest groups, for instance. that have very specific goals. There's groups like Greenpeace, the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, and other environmental groups. They spend their entire careers trying to convince people in power to make changes to better, let's say, the environment. And they go to their elected members of Congress, they sit down with them, and like I said, they make their proposals, or they may already have a draft bill they want to show their member of Congress that, if passed, that bill, now a law, could do some good. So people in Congress listen to these interest groups, they listen to their ideas, and they make their own decisions about, okay, we have these ideas from these different groups. How do we turn this into law or an initiative that concerns the people? So it's bringing these ideas together, it's passing the laws, it's creating a new department of government, for instance, and it's through public policy. It's that saying about politics, how the sausage gets made, all of the backroom dealing and all the negotiations. It happens through public policy. The different groups, whether it be your member of Congress, the person who runs an interest group, or someone who's a lobbyist, they're all part of this system that turns an idea and a goal into reality through public policy. Question 41. We're back to a bar graph. Very good. And we're talking about the fundamentals of economics. And it says U.S. GDP falls 3.5% in biggest drop since 1946. Okay, here we go. One economic effect of the United States during the period from 1960 to 1975 was increasing imports, decreasing inflation, rising standard of living, or a shrinking manufacturing sector. The answer is C, a rising standard of living. If we look at this period, the question asks us to 1960 to about 75, we see about every year is in the green. There was positive economic growth, sometimes over 5% economic growth. And when you have high economic growth, one direct effect is a rising standard of living. The country becomes richer, there's more economic opportunities, and people can afford to live in better homes, have another car, or have another child, and everyone's happy. At least that's the idea. Now, let's take a look at our others, though, make sure why they're incorrect. In a good economy between 1960 and 75, the United States was an export-focused economy. We were making a lot of the stuff the world wanted, and that's one of the reasons why we were rich. So at that point, why would we increase imports? We're producing things for our own people and the rest of the world. We don't need to import anything, or at least not import a lot of stuff. So imports are going to stay about the same, at least until 75, when imports do go up. Inflation is actually going to increase during this period. Remember, we had an earlier discussion on inflation. In a good economy, inflation goes up. In bad times, here, and especially here, inflation goes down when the economy is bad. And last but not least, a good economy during this period in American history, the 60s through the mid-70s, the manufacturing sector is huge. It's only after the mid-70s does the United States start to import a lot of basic goods from other countries, starting in Japan, for instance, and then mainly China today. So because of those imports that happen later, only then does the manufacturing sector shrink. During the 60s and mid-70s, it's huge. So that is why D is incorrect. But during this period, it was very prosperous for the average American, and it was a completely different time from today. Okay, question 42. The fundamentals of economics, and we are looking at Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, 1776. This book, everybody, laid the foundation for modern capitalism, the economic system we've used in this country for hundreds of years. Now, according to Smith, what factor promotes economic growth? So, when the economy is good, why does that happen? Laws, religion, self-interest, or labor unions? The answer is C, self-interest. One of Smith's key ideas was that Human beings are selfish people. And if I want to start a business, for instance, I want my business to succeed. I'm not thinking about the business next door. I'm not thinking about anyone else but me. And if I'm trying to make my life better, and if everyone else has that same idea, we're all sort of working towards the same goal, becoming richer. And if everyone's doing well, or if at least everyone's trying to do well in business, that's going to promote economic growth. Well, let's say you didn't know that, though. Let's see if we can find it, though, in our text. Let's take a look, though. Remember, if you don't know the answer, keep the key idea from each answer choice in the back of your mind and see if it shows up. Doing some light skimming. Doing some light skimming. What Smith says is that he intends only his own security. What this means is that he, being a business owner, or someone just in the economy, is looking out for himself, looking out for number one, self-interest. And by directing that industry in such a manner as it produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain. So if I start a business, I want to do well. But like I said earlier, I don't care about any other business that does what I do. I don't have any ill will against them, but I want to succeed. And if they have to fail to do it, so be it. So self-interest runs modern capitalism. Keep that in mind. And if you're still having trouble, also, using process of elimination, it is fairly easy to knock out A, B, and D because the text does not mention any of it. No law, no religion, no labor union. So keep that in mind. If it doesn't show up in the text, get rid of it. And if you still have to guess, process of elimination is your friend. Okay, same document, question 43. The invisible hand principle is at work in what interest? Companies limit exports to trade with self-interested individuals. The government regulates activities by self-interested individuals. Entrepreneurs take actions to benefit themselves at the expense of others. Entrepreneurs take self-interested actions to limit growth of unproductive companies. The correct answer is C. If you've been paying attention so far on our previous question, we know that self-interest does play a large role in Smith's view of economics, which is capitalism. Now, in capitalism, the government's not going to regulate you, because that's not the role of government in Smith's view. Companies do not limit trade with other people because they're self-interested. Well, Smith's saying everyone's self-interested, so limiting exports to self-interested people would just hurt the economy. And D, entrepreneurs take self-interested actions to limit growth of unproductive companies. Well, here's the thing. Remember when I said earlier that if I'm looking out for me and don't care about my neighbor, I also don't care about what he's doing or if he's unproductive or not. I'm not paying attention to how my neighbor is making more or less today than yesterday. I'm only making decisions that affect me. So through that process of elimination, entrepreneurs will always take actions to benefit themselves at the expense of others. Because as we remember, there's only so much money in the economy. Okay, question 44. Now, on the actual Social Studies GED section, you will see one or two questions that are called standalone questions. You will not be directed to look at any document or any picture. But like I said, these come up very rarely, so only expect one or two at the most. Okay, that said, our category is the structure of the United States government. What is the name of the constitutional provision that allows Congress additional powers if necessary? The Elastic Clause, the Legislative Clause, the Concurrent Power Clause, or the Enumerated Power Clause? The correct answer is A, the Elastic Clause, which is also known as the Necessary and Proper Clause in the Constitution. Now, when the founders wrote the Constitution in 1787, they knew that over time, the government's responsibilities and challenges to the government would evolve, and they would evolve into things the founders had no idea about. The founders knew they couldn't read the future, so they said, okay, government, you have enumerated powers. This is what the Constitution actually gives government the power to do. An example of an enumerated power, for instance, would be the president being the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, or the House of Representatives to pass tax legislation, or to propose tax legislation, because that's their specific power over the Senate. Now, for instance, if Congress has the power to tax, well, it has to put all that tax money somewhere, right? So in the early 19th century, Congress said, okay, look, we're going to use the elastic clause, the necessary and proper clause, to create a national bank where we can regulate the national economy from and do a few other things. This went in front of the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld the Congress's ability to do that under the elastic clause. So throughout history, the elastic clause has been what has allowed the American system of government to evolve to meet the challenges we need. That is why the president has a cabinet to oversee all the executive departments, because when the founders created the office of the presidency, the president had very little to do. But as the country grew and became more complex, the president had to do so many other things, and the elastic clause is the legal authority that allows the president to do those things. Can some of those actions be said that they're unconstitutional? Yeah, and that's why there's been a lot of Supreme Court cases about, well, does this action actually comply with the elastic clause, or is it something that's illegal? And that's what the Supreme Court deals with many, many times throughout American history, and even today. Now, as far as these other three are concerned, there is nothing that actually has any of these names in the Constitution, besides enumerated powers, but there is no enumerated powers clause, so to speak. Enumerated powers are just the entirety of the Constitution when it comes to the powers of the federal government. Okay. Last but not least, question 45. We're talking about the Civil War, and we're talking about the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Why might this provision of the Kansas-Nebraska Act have angered Northerners living in free states? Okay, 1854, we got about 7 more years until the Civil War happens, and we know at this point the tensions are running high, and everyone has an idea that maybe wars are coming. We don't know yet, but it could happen. So why is this part of this law that's supposed to actually make things better, why is it going to make people angry? So is it because it would change the minds of many abolitionists? Remember, the abolitionists were people who did not like slavery and wanted to get rid of it. Would the law necessitate legalizing the international slave trade? Would it mean that Northerners would have to begin owning enslaved people again, even in free states? Would it force slavery on them? Or could it allow slaveholders to increase their representation in Congress? Correct answer is D. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was the last-ditch effort by the federal government to really keep the Union together, and what it allowed settlers in the Kansas and Nebraska territories, they weren't states yet, but the settlers could vote on the issue of slavery. It wasn't going to be up to Congress to say you get slaves or you don't get slaves. It was an idea called popular sovereignty. And the idea was people would move to these territories, they would get together, make a small Congress, so to speak, and they would have a vote. Okay, everybody, who wants slaves, who doesn't? And whichever side won, that would be what the state would become. This gets into, it sounds like a good idea on paper, but what happens is people, pro-slave people, anti-slave people, flood the states to get the majority of the vote. And what actually happens is that there's so many of these very passionate people on both sides, armed violence breaks out. And it's called Bleeding Kansas. It begins in 1854, and it's like a mini Civil War that goes on. And it doesn't end, actually, until the Civil War ends in 1865. So It's an 11-year-long conflict about the future of slavery in these areas. So if either of these states had said they wanted to become slave states, that means there's more senators and representatives in Congress that are pro-slavery, and that would tip the balance of power from the northern states, which were free states, to the slave states in the South. Now, that's the history lesson. Where do we get this idea in the text? Let's look. And we can read the whole thing. It is fairly short. It being the true intent and meaning of this act, not to legislate slavery into any territory or state. Like I said earlier, Congress was letting the states decide. So they're saying, we're hands off this time, guys. It's up to you. Nor to exclude it therefrom, but to leave the people thereof perfectly free to form and regulate their domestic institutions in their own way. So Congress is giving the power, that popular sovereignty. Hey guys, all white men who have the right to vote, once they move there, they can vote on this, and we're going to accept the outcome no matter what it is. And that's what made Northerners really scared, because the federal government was taking this hands-off approach. And that could have led to more slavery and the power of people who believed in slavery in the United States. So it's truly ironic that a law that was passed to lower tensions actually raised them and was one of the main events that kick-started the Civil War a few years later. Okay, looks like we're done with the test. Let us see how we did. All right. Well, obviously, it looks like we got 100%. Now, when you take a practice test like this on Smart Edition Academy or somewhere else, you probably won't get 100% the very first time you take the test, or any practice test for the GED. My advice, and my advice comes from a very important place. I used to teach many test prep classes in the past when I was a high school teacher, and I always told my students when they got their results on their tests, always look at the categories first to see your areas of improvement. Let's say, yeah, you have a few categories that are hundreds. Ignore those categories. Pat yourself on the back, and then move on to the ones where you are doing poorly. Take your 3 lowest categories. Let's say for these last 3 you made a 70, a 60, and a 50, and they're your lowest. Start your studying there. Make that your #1 priority, everybody, because if you can improve in your worst subject, that can have a tremendous impact on your overall score. It can save you time towards earning your GED. It can save you money. It can help you get into college faster with a lower score. So always look at the results and then plan your study around that. And that's also why it's a really great idea to take a practice test before you ever do any studying on the GED or any other standardized test. All right, that's my advice. That said, everybody, great job for sticking through the entire practice test. As a reminder, you can take a full-length GED practice test for free by using the links in the description below. A GED study group and the GED online study course will also be found. If you have any questions or want to see more videos like this, comment below and don't forget to subscribe. All right, everyone. That's all there is from me. I wish you a great rest of your day and good luck on the GED.